new generation reached college age in the 1980s and 90s, the United States underwent a massive cultural shift. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, ushering in a new era of political and cultural conservatism. Activism on college campuses remained largely muted into the 1990s. This held true at LMU. Though some groups remained active, including the Black Student Union and the Chicano student group known as MECHA, for a number of reasons, the activist spirit of the 60s and 70s largely faded away.
There was the end of the war, the end of the draft, and so students didn't feel as much of the pressure as they felt before, and so this was one of those things where maybe students felt as though they could concentrate on themselves and didn't have to worry about the ills of society. There were still, of course, pockets of students who remained activists that pushed against apartheid South Africa, that pushed against some of the United States actions in Latin America and that sort of thing. But largely, after the 1960s and 70s, there was a dip in the activist spirit of students, going all the way through the early 2000s.
A theory would be it was the go-go 80s, so to speak. People really cared about just getting the right job and making a lot of money. I was in school and all I wanted to do was get my degree.
Things were changing on LMU's campus as well. After more than 20 years as president, Father Donald Merrifield stepped down in 1984. Merrifield had presided over a major expansion of the university, with 13 new buildings and an expanded law school campus built during his tenure. He also began a drive to increase diversity on LMU's campus, which continued with his successors.
I started teaching in January of '88. So from '88 until 2003, I was involved in the life of the campus. What I noticed in those years was a change which began with one president and continued with another. So Jim Loughran to Tom O'Malley. They wanted Loyola to replicate the demographics of Los Angeles. So they wanted a more diverse faculty and staff. They wanted a more diverse student population. So they began recruiting in different ways. They began changing the curriculum to make it more, just more reflective of an intercultural reality in Los Angeles. And so what I noticed then from coming back here in January of '88, it was a very different campus than it had been when I was here. And it got even more, it just kept evolving. It kept evolving. More and more African Americans, Latinos, and other faculty were joining. So by the time I became dean, it was basically, that was part of the Loyola Marymount DNA. It had really changed dramatically.
The climate was wonderful. It was vibrant and probably similar to the way it is today. It was incredibly diverse.
The early 90s, I think, were a time of some division on campus in terms of a group of students that were very socially engaged and politically engaged, and then there was another group of students that was less so.
I don't think a lot of people who were studying at that time had any clue what was going to be coming down the pipeline or how it affected everybody. I don't think issues of race or police misconduct, particularly as it related to people of color, I had never heard them discussed before. People went to school together, but they may not necessarily have really understood anything about the other world that the other person sitting right next to them may be coming from.
Then, in the spring of 1992, Los Angeles exploded. On April 29, 1992, riots began in South Central LA after a jury acquitted 4 LAPD officers who had violently beaten black motorist Rodney King. Over 6 days, looting, arson, and violence spread throughout LA.
I remember there was a tremendous amount of disbelief and anger, particularly among the minority students, but there wasn't generally much of a reaction until the rioting started. A curfew was imposed, which had never been done before, and that confined everybody to campus past, I think it was 10 o'clock at night. The Black Student Union and MECHA in particular were extremely well organized at that time, much more organized than anybody else. So they sent out a mass voicemail to all of their members saying that if you knew somebody who needed a place to stay, and you were a commuter student, or you didn't live on campus, or you, for whatever reason, needed to bunk down, essentially, they had resources that they would provide for you.
I mean, this was something that really agitated this campus. And there was a lot of protest around that, and what was the university going to do, and how are we going to respond? So that kept alive the real issues. I remember one of our faculty, John Davis, who was the chair of African American Studies, had been racially profiled, pulled over by the police, told to get out of his car. He was in an area of the city where they didn't think a black person should be. You know, hands in the car, frisked. That comes back to campus when it's one of your own. And that was the kind of shock that was going on that really alerted people that, you know, there's a need for change in Los Angeles.
It was a very frightening time because the National Guard was deployed on Sepulveda in Manchester. You could see and smell the smoke and the fires. People were breaking into all sorts of businesses. The looting was unbelievable to watch. The fires that were being set were horrifying. Obviously, that led to a lot of understandable stress and anxiety for people who had friends or family who were living in those impacted areas. So the question arose, how can I possibly pretend that this is not going on? And how can I possibly sit for my exams when the whole world seems to be imploding all around us?
It was clear that on campus there were a number of students that were deeply concerned. And then there were other students who came from a more affluent background. And because they came from a more affluent background, for them it seemed to me that it was just really more about getting out of their final exams.
It was sort of presumed that only people who had a lower socioeconomic background would be impacted by these events. And other groups all across the board were saying, wait a minute, you know, I don't live in South Central, but my father's a firefighter. My father's a cop. My mother is a paramedic, and they're going into those areas. So it was a very eye-opening experience to how things affect everybody.
Angry and demanding to be heard, a large group of students held a sit-in at LMU's Loyola Boulevard entrance, then the only entrance to campus. They remained there for hours, blocking the entrance, until the administration agreed to address their concerns.
Ultimately, they understood. The compromise was you could elect to take the grade you had earned thus far as your final grade, or you could sit for the exam as scheduled. But it was up to you. And that gave most students that modicum of control to do what they needed to do for whatever was best for them.
When I was a student, it just seemed to me, even though the campus, well, it was much smaller, and even though we had a Black Student Union and we had the Latino presence of students, so it was a multi-ethnic campus even in the 60s and 70s, there seemed to be a more cohesiveness around student activism and student engagement. Now that may have been because of the Vietnam War, and in many cases the students that came to LMU were not affluent students. Even the Anglo students were not affluent students. So the war affected everybody, whereas I think in the early 90s the civil unrest, or there was the O.J. Simpson trial, there was the Rodney King verdict, those seemed to break according to more ethnic and socially conscious and maybe socioeconomic lines. Now, of course, I'm not a sociologist, so those were my impressions.
Ultimately, it would take 20 years for student activism to reignite, and when it did, issues of race and police brutality would once again be at the forefront.